Um, Hello to all of you. I don't know what should I say. Probably good evening because most of us are around the evening time zone, and but Patrick, our guest today, is this is morning for him. My name is David Levy-Fowler, and I'm here with Nir Kosti, and the both of us are hosting a series and a project on the metrics of regulation. Metrics of regulation meaning um, thinking about how to improve the study and the practice of regulation via quantitative measures, conceptualization of quantitative measures, their strengths and weaknesses, their problems and the need for them, the fact that we don't have well-developed measures of regulation, not of um, the number of regulation, but not also for the performance of regulation or the institutions of regulation, the context and the content of regulation. So this is the project, bringing various projects around those metrics of regulation. And our guest today is Patrick McLaughlin. I hope I'm pronouncing well, but you can correct me later on if needed. And Nir will introduce Patrick, and then Patrick will present his RegData project. So Nir, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, and David. Thank you, Patrick. I guess most of our audience, I assume most of our audience is already familiar with this, with the RegData project, which is a pioneering project on the measurement and quantification of regulation, but not necessarily the faces behind. So I will briefly introduce Patrick. Patrick is the Director of Policy Analytics and the Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His research focuses mostly on regulations and the regulatory process. He also created and leads the RegData and QuantGov projects using machine learning and other tools of data science to quantify governance indicators in federal and state regulations and also in other policy documents. Yeah, Patrick, please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nir and David. Pleasure to be invited to speak with you all. Yeah, and I guess I should assume that most of you do have some familiarity with this project, but nonetheless, I will go into to some detail on what I've done in the RegData project, and also I want to cover some things that I'm building now, things that we're looking to have in the future that would help on the metric of regulation. So let me share my slides here. Oh, and David, it is Patrick McLaughlin. And I just saw that there's some recent research on difficult to pronounce last names, and the more difficult they are, the less success apparently you have. So those of you who have easy to pronounce last names are, I guess, lucky. Anyway, the RegData project has been running for quite a while. I started this back in 2012, and now, 12 years later, we have released over 5 different versions, completely major upgrade versions of the whole project. So I'm going to run through all that, but let me just start with why we built RegData, and then we'll go into some of the core features going forward. I'll talk about some examples of uses of RegData and applied research. And then lastly, maybe the thing most of you are interested in is data availability, what you can get and use in your own work. Everything we've produced in this project, we've made publicly available. So it's been widely used, as you may already know. So why did we build RegData? David hinted at this in his introduction. Fundamentally, we need to know some very basic things about regulation, not just in the U.S., but in every modern democracy where regulation is a typical policy instrument. But the basic problem is we just have so many regulations that no one can read them. No one can turn them into a comprehensive data set. So that was the original problem I set out to solve here. Can we get some sort of comprehensive, objective, and replicable measurement of the total quantity of regulation in existence at different points in time for a given country or a given jurisdiction, and even better, for a given group within that country? So that was the original goal. And at its core, when I first built it in 2012, I was hacking together a data set using different techniques, a combination of Python scripts and a SQL database and some Stata scripts. But over time, it has all evolved into something a bit more coherent, I should say. And so at its core now, we have just a software package. We've made it, many parts of it at least, publicly available on GitHub. It's primarily Python scripts now. So I do want to mention that to you all. If any of you are not afraid to work with Python and develop your own data sets from text that you have, we do have data available, or excuse me, scripts available on GitHub that help you develop some of the same metrics out of your own documents that you might have. So let me jump into some of the background then. When I was in grad school, it was obvious to me that regulations had been building up and we didn't have good data. So that was the first thing we wanted to solve here. What does the buildup of regulations do on different economic outcomes? And as well as, can we get research on why we see the buildup of regulation occur in so many different countries, so many different states? Like, regulatory accumulation is not unique to the U.S., as I'm sure you all know. These things tend to build up over time. So to do this, we started the RegData Project. I'm going to describe it at a very basic level first, and then I'll get into some of the more complicated ways that we built out RegData later on. But the very first tenet of RegData is thinking about, what are regulations doing? Why do we have regulations in the first place? That will help us measure them better. So at their core, regulations are designed to either prohibit you from doing some things or obligate you to do other things. They're designed to change human actions. And so that's what I set out to measure. How many different prohibitions and obligations can we find in regulatory text? So from an economics perspective, you can think of this as ways that regulations constrain the individual or the businesses, the economic agent's choice set. That's the way we're trying to measure things to start off with. So if you go into the text of regulations themselves, here's an example. This is just a screen grab from the Code of Federal Regulations at the U.S. You can zoom in on all these different titles, which are basically different books of regulation. And then you click on one of these, or in other words, open up the book and look at the regulation. And here are a bunch of words that I've highlighted. The word shall, I've got highlighted on this page. You can see it occurring quite frequently. This is common to all regulations. Whatever the language is, you can find some key words that tend to be associated with prohibitions and obligations. And that's what we're doing at the very basic level, pulling out one single sentence here. There's a lot of text, and there's just one word, shall. This sentence is saying, don't leave an energized electrical circuit lying around in your workplace because people might get hurt. So we're counting this as one single restriction, a regulatory restriction being the term. Is it comprehensive? Does it catch all ways in which restrictions are created? Does it catch all ways in which the choice set is constrained? No, of course not. But we don't think we could ever get to that point of being comprehensive of all restrictedness of regulation. So we're just trying to come up with a pretty good proxy. So what does that look like over time? Here's a graph of regulatory restrictions over time from 1970 to 2022, I want to say in there. I may not add the last couple of years of data, but we're going from about 400,000 in 1970 to today. We have just over 1.1 million regulatory restrictions. And these are specifically the words shall, must, may not, prohibited, and required. So again, comprehensive, probably not, but consistent with what actually is contained in the regulations in terms of restrictiveness, we think so. We've extended this to other countries. Here's a graph from Canada. I'm showing you this picture just because I want to demonstrate that we tend to see regulatory accumulation that build up over time. in every jurisdiction we've looked at. We've seen this in Canada here. We have data going back to 2006. We have data for Australia going back even farther. We see the same picture at the state level in the U.S. We see regulatory accumulation generally occurring. So that's one first insight of this whole project. Not surprising, but now we have hard numbers for all these different jurisdictions that we've studied, and we see accumulation of regulations pretty much as a rule, unless the jurisdiction has proactively changed their regulatory process to try to avoid that outcome. Another way you can look at the data is just pull out specific agencies' regulations. So here within RegData, we can look at, for example, the tax code. The tax code, of course, is initiated by statute, just like all regulations, but then it's enhanced by the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and other regulators. And so you get pretty much the same picture as you saw at the total aggregate level, but here we can zoom in on specific regulators within the U.S. and likewise in other countries. So one of the ways to break down the data, I guess, is the point here. You can break it down by topic area, or you can break it down by the regulator themselves. So another thing that we do, and this is probably the more important thing for people who are doing academic research, is we can break it down by industry area. I want to make one quick point here. For those who are worried about some of the nuances of counting restrictions by looking at just words, shall, must, may not, prohibited, and required, we have made some enhancements to this. That used to be the case in early versions of RegData, that we would, for example, miss when a regulation would create a list of requirements that were using a colon. So if you had some sentence that said, no business shall, and then there was a colon, and then there was a list of different things that had to be done, say 3 different things. In reality, that should be 3 different shalls. Initial versions 1 through 3.2 of RegData, we weren't catching all those different items on the list. But since RegData 4.0, we've been able to catch the numbers of restrictions that are contained in lists as well. So quick overview there of just, counting restrictions. Why is it useful? Well, it's easy to understand. It's highly correlated with the total restrictiveness of regulations. And I say that based on my own reading of regulatory text. I look at the numbers of restrictions from RegData. I look at my own count of restrictions within a page or multiple pages of regulation, and we see a high correlation there. It's also highly correlated with word count overall. Of course, there are some weaknesses, just like every metric of anything. It's imperfect for budgeting and accounting. It's not comprehensive. We miss exceptions and exemptions. We sometimes count regulations that are internal facing, where a regulator might be restricting their own choice set, their own action set, versus external facing. So there are some drawbacks. I already mentioned the improvements from 4.0, so I'm going to jump ahead. This is, I think, the more important part for you. RegData also breaks down regulation into different industries. So this is very useful if you're doing economics research and you have economic data that's broken down by, for example, the North American Industry Classification System, where we have data on employment, data on profits, spending, etc. So this is really the heart of RegData as an academic tool, industry classification. So what do we do here? If you imagine these blue boxes, these are like a bunch of different books of regulation. And the task here is, how can we figure out what these books of regulation are about and classify them into different categories? We want to know what's the probability that this book is about some subject, and then we also want to know, ideally, what's the consequence to that subject if the book is about them. So the subject here is different industries, right? Manufacturing, or within manufacturing, like wood furniture manufacturing industries, for example. So the very first way we did this, and this was published in Regulation and Governance back in 2017, was with what I'll call a human-assisted algorithm, we essentially came up with a bunch of search terms that were based on the different sectors that were defined in the North American industry classification system, dividing the economy up into different sectors, different industries, and then use the frequency of those search terms occurring in the text of regulation to come up with a probability for each regulation being relevant to that industry. So let me run through an example. Here is the title, the book's regulation called Mineral Resources. If you just look at the most frequent words in those books, you see shall, the restriction being the top, but you also see the words mining and coal and mine, surface, words that are indicative that this set of regulations is probably about mineral resources. So if you just looked at this list of top 10 words, you could probably guess that this is from the set of regulations about mining. So that's sort of the logic here. Can we come up with the right words to search for to be able to guess what the book is about? So we came up with that, as I said, based on the industry descriptions in the North American Industry Classification System. So here's a sample of descriptions: crop production, oil and gas, extraction, etc. All these different ways of defining parts of the economy. And a really simplified way of thinking about how we did this: we took the initial description and just had a set of rules that created permutations of those descriptions. Right. So here's a couple of permutations, but there's a lot more for the industry paper manufacturing that we came up with here. So I'm going to just kind of jump through that. There's more available, more rules are described in the paper. But since we did this initial version, this human-assisted algorithm, we've since progressed to machine learning algorithms. So that's where we are right now. So let me just run through that really fast. What do we do to classify regulation into different industries these days? Well, in the U.S., we have the Federal Register, which luckily enough is often labeled with the industry that a regulation is about. This occurs in the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which is required for some regulations to be in a proposed regulation. It will evaluate how that regulation is going to be affecting small businesses within certain industries. So sometimes those analyses will actually list the NAICS code that they will be affecting. So we took that as ground truth, as training documents. Then once we harvested all those Federal Register notices, we could train an algorithm to recognize text that's about those same topics. So here we went to the Federal Register. They have a very nice API. You can pull in all sorts of notices of proposed rulemakings and final rules that have these labels on them. We train our algorithm. So for example, here's a notice proposed rulemaking that is labeled internally that to be affecting hospitals. It actually lists NAICS code 622 in the analysis. It also lists NAICS code 621 in the analysis. So we have now a training document. We can use this to train the algorithm. Did that for we had roughly 22,000, I think the number is, training documents that we pulled in from the Federal Register. And then we did some out of sample validation. So that roughly means we train an algorithm with, say, 80% or some number of the training documents we have for a certain industry, and then we test how well that does on the ones that we left out, the 20% that we left out. So we can do that 5 times over, 10 times over is typical in the industry. It's called 5-fold or 10-fold cross-validation. And then we have some, I'm going to fly through this part because I want to leave time for question and answers, but we have some performance standards that we set up. We want to see these algorithms achieve at least some minimum bar for performance before we release the data publicly. So I'll touch on that in a second. And then once we got the algorithms all trained, then we set them loose on the Code of Federal Regulations or on state regulations or on Canadian regulations, whatever the case may be, in order to figure out, of these millions of words in the regulations, which ones are relevant to different industries. So that's at the heart of the industry classification these days. So the performance metrics, we use what's called F1 scores. It's a combination of rewarding true positives and penalizing false negatives and false positives. So it's combining all these different ways that you can either have an algorithm classify right or have an error rates within these. The easiest way to think about this, if you're familiar with R squared, it's not exactly an R squared, but it's you can think of it that way. It's just a nice little rule of thumb. You're looking for a score that's getting closer to a 1. It would be very good if you got to 0.98, for example. So that's what we use as our performance metric. And then specifically within that, we want to see the F1 score from 5-fold cross-validation be better than subtracting one standard deviation from within an industry. Take the F1 score from the 5-fold cross-validation, subtract one standard deviation for F1 score within the industry. And if the value is greater than 0.5, then it passes. So 0 here would be random in F1, 1 would be perfect. So we want to see at least better than 50% improvement on random. If we get at least that well, then we will release the data publicly. So if you go grab the data, you'll notice that there's some industries that are missing. That's why it's typically because in those cases we haven't done at least as well as what we want to see in our performance thresholds. So then combining all the data, we now have probability that a book or that a regulation is about some industry. We have consequence in the form of the total count of restrictions in that regulation, the shalls and the must. And simple way to combine them that we also suggested in our regulation and governance publication is just multiply them by each other. The risk times the probability times the restrictions. And so that's typically what people are using in their research. This is a somewhat old chart, but if you just look at the number of industry-specific restrictions, that is the probability for each industry, for each book of regulation, times the number of restrictions in that book, summed across all books, you can get a total industry regulation number for each year. And this is at the federal level in the U.S. And just a breakdown at the 4-digit level of the top 10 most regulated industries. So this is maybe just a sanity check. Does this make sense? Are these what you imagine the most regulated industries might be at the 4-digit level? And it makes sense to me at least, and peer reviewers too. So summary, the core features of RegData. We've got data at the federal level from 1970 through 2022. We have within the data set restriction counts. That's the prohibitions and obligations, including lists. We have also total word count. We know which agencies and which departments produce them. And then we break it down into different industries by producing the probability that different regulations are relevant to the NAICS codes defined at the 2-digit, 3-digit, and 4-digit level. So those have been used. Typically, it'll be the industry level data being used in research. I'm going to just show you some pictures now just to show you the richness of the data. Here is one way that you could break down the data. This is agency and industry relationships. So here we're looking at a single industry, electric power generation, transmission, and distribution. And we're looking at the total number of regulatory restrictions for that industry. So that'll be the very top line on this graph. But then we're breaking it down within that total by the different agencies that are producing regulations that are affecting that industry. So you can see it's a pretty rich data set. You can also see that the Environmental Protection Agency grew from relatively unimportant when we first started this graph in the 1970s to the most important regulator for this industry by 2014 or whatever that last year is. You can also break things down by the authorizing statute. This is also information that's within the regulation. So this was a paper I published in Journal of Financial Regulation a few years ago, breaking down the regulations that came out of the Dodd-Frank Act. So this took a bit more analysis, but you can pull in the statutory authority of a regulation and then aggregate them. And the conclusion in this paper was Dodd-Frank was a really big driver of new regulation. No surprise. There's been tons of usage in research, but there's also been usage in the private sector. These are just some examples that I know about. It's been used in regulatory budgeting at the state level in the U.S., as well as by some provinces in Canada. So it's become a pretty valuable public resource. And finally, I do want to leave time for questions. It looks like I am leaving plenty of time. So I'm going to briefly talk about some ways that research has been cultivated using RegData, because I want to make it easier for you if you wanted to do that. So typically what you're doing when you're using RegData is looking at the total effect, like the effect of regulatory accumulation overall on some economic outcome. The most obvious thing to look at, for me at least, was economic growth. RegData is not so great for nuanced applications, like what is the effect of one additional regulation on economic growth or on some industry's performance. It's more of, we rely on the law of large numbers here, right? One regulation may be very different from another regulation, but any 10,000 regulations is going to be similar in terms of its average effect to another 10,000 regulations. So that's very much what we're relying on here with RegData. And then what we'll typically see is you look at the effects on, the economic outcome with industry-specific effects. You rely on the variation across industries, which there is tremendous variation, to identify the effect. Alternatively, we have seen some applications where you put regulation on the left-hand side. For example, how do different economic features affect regulation, things like population, or how big an industry is, or how much lobbying an industry engages in? How does that change, if it does, the the outcome, which would, in that case, would be the total amount of regulations they created in a year or in existence in the jurisdiction. So those are the typical approaches that we see. One of the first papers that came out of this project was looking at the effect of growth. So how did we do that paper? Well, it's a combination of measurement and modeling. The measurement is obviously solved by RegData here, but the modeling part we had to build out. And this would be, I think, my preference for how you think about the effects of regulation. Here, with RegData, we're just measuring how much there is. And you can think of that as similar to like employment data, right? We have jobs numbers released in the U.S. every quarter. People pay attention to the number of new jobs created, or the total employment levels. But of course, within those numbers, there's substantial variation. One job may create less value than another job may create more value to GDP. So to know like what is the usefulness of that employment number, typically economists are plugging it into a model. They're not assigning some value to each one of these things, but we can say when the employment level changes, this has this effect on the growth rate or on productivity. So that's similar for RegData. RegData is most useful, in my opinion, when it can be plugged into a formal economic model, and then you can pull out from the parameter estimates in that model what the effect of, say, regulatory accumulation can be. So in this study, cumulative cost of regulations, published in Review of Economic Dynamics in 2020, we built an endogenous growth model. Some brief features, I'm not going to break out the model. Some features of the model, though, are that long-run growth is driven by business investment, which then in turn leads to productivity growth. Productivity growth ultimately is what drives economic growth overall. We incorporated RegData into that model by having this estimating an effect of regulatory accumulation on business investments. Use those estimates to calculate regulations' effect on productivity growth, because remember, investment drives productivity growth, and which in turn drives economic growth. And then once we had this model estimated, we were able to go back and run a simulation. What would happen in an alternative world, which we didn't observe, so we had to create the counterfactual, where regulation didn't grow like it did, instead was held constant at the level we observed in 1980. So the result of that simulation is shown here in this picture. The economy would have been roughly 25% larger in this simulation by the year 2012, excuse me, than it actually was. The dotted line is the simulation. The solid line is the actual observed economy. So that's the what you typically see for research. We have a combination of measurement in some model. There's some that use less. There's a lot of research that uses less formal models. You just drop the number into a regression estimate and see what happens. We're seeing more and more research using RegData that is not just showing correlations, but have found ways to infer causality. Instrumental variables methods have cropped up here and there. Some difference in difference designs have cropped up here and there. So the data is really, I think, led to a lot of research insights that maybe weren't even predictable from the beginning. So last couple of slides here. The data availability, we have data for the U.S., Canada, and Australia. Federal data for the U.S. goes from 1970 to 2022. It's also broken down by industry. State data for the U.S., there's a typo there. That should not say 2000. It should say 2020 to 2023. I wish we had data back to 2000 for 48 states, and we also break those down by industry. We have Canadian data going back to 2006 through 2022, and we have industry data for Canada as well. We have Australian data from 1977 through 22. We don't have industry data for Australia because Australia does not use the North American Industry Classification System, so our algorithms didn't work so well there. Then we have seen other projects crop up independently that have used the RegData approach in Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Denmark. I might be missing some that I don't know of. And then going forward, we do have some topic-specific data sets that have been developed and that are being developed. We have data where we've trained an algorithm to recognize when a regulation contains occupational licensing regulations. We have data where we've trained an algorithm to recognize when a regulation is speaking about a specific occupation, not necessarily occupational licensing, just focused on an occupation defined by the standard occupation classification codes. In a new project I'm working on with Dustin Chambers, and this is for the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where I'm also affiliated, working to come up with an index of small business exemptions and exceptions contained within federal and state regulations. And so far, that seems very promising. That's showing some of the expected outcomes there as well. And then going forward in the future, maybe a topic of discussion where I think metrics of regulation will go is going to be incorporating source documents like I'm doing here, pulling in the actual regulatory text itself, but then also incorporating what I call user documents, meaning the businesses that have to comply with regulation or even individuals. Some sort of, there's a wealth of text about user documents here too. Think about like publicly traded companies in the U.S. that have to file quarterly reports with the SEC, and they will often talk about regulatory risks. So those sorts of documents can be pulled in. And then supervision and enforcement data pulled in from regulators themselves can ultimately be pulled in. I think these are the three sources that can be combined into some metric to rule them all at some point in the future. So I think I've left ample time for questions. I'm done with my presentation, so please have at it.
Thank you so much. Let's open up the floor for questions. Anyone wants to start? I would say that this is very impressive. Marcus, you go first.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very impressive, Patrick. I'm involved just now in a study being done for the European Commission on something called flags of convenience. It's where you register a ship, not where the owner actually lives, but in a country that has lax regulation, enables you not to pay the crew properly and to avoid environmental regulation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we've basically been asked to do is to look at the regulations that are being implemented by the EU and by the international bodies and compare them to identify which regulations deal with which sectors, fishing, cruise, demolition is even considered a sector, and which domains, safety, employment, environment, et cetera, et cetera. I wondered if you've done anything in that kind of anything similar to that in what you've been looking at, because we're not just looking at the regulations themselves, we're looking at the extent to which they're implemented and enforced, and trying to make recommendations to the EU how they should improve dealing with flags of convenience.
Yeah, and in a way, I would say we have. The first part of your problem, are the regulations about certain topic areas, industry topic areas. Fishing you mentioned as an example. That's very similar to what we've done with the industry classification part of RegData, I would say. I don't know that the classifiers we built with RegData would necessarily work on EU regulations, again, because of them depending on NAICS codes, North American Industry Classification System trainers that we have, but they might. If they don't, I mean, I think that the approach could be replicable at the EU level. I assume, Marcus, that there's simply too many regulations for you to read and hand classify here. So you want some sort of.
They're not. They're quite a limited number of regulations. I mean, we're not looking for exoteric or exotic regulations. We're looking specifically at the ones that are being enacted by the International Maritime Organization, by the ILO, by the EU, and the different organs of the EU. So, I mean, we're talking maybe in the region of 200 or 300 regulations in total. That really is not our problem. Our problem more is to what extent they're being implemented and enforced by the various or avoided, basically, because we're also talking about money laundering and security and everything associated with the whole issue of shipping.
Yeah. So I guess the short answer on that part of it is I have not come up with some sort of solution for looking at the variation in enforcement of regulations. A long time ago, I did try to FOIA a few different federal agencies, Freedom of Information Act requests for federal agencies to get their enforcement data, but it was so inconsistent across agencies, it just didn't seem like something I could really hang my hat on. The only thing that we've seen come up so far and that sort of tells you the effectiveness of regulation is to put them in a regression with some sort of outcome that you care about. So I'm not, in this specific context, if you have variation across jurisdictions in terms of what the regulations look like, but you don't know, or maybe you don't actually, probably what you look at, ideally, you don't have variation in sort of how the regulations are written, but you do have variation in some of the maybe safety outcomes or wage outcomes. That would be probably an indicator, but that's not direct, right? You're definitely only getting implicit indicators there of variation in enforcement. That's as close as I've ever seen.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let me raise a question. I know that Michael Bauer also wants to raise a question, but I might come with even more questions until Michael finishes on questions. So let me stay with my own two. The first, you mentioned application, meaning regulatory budgeting is one application. Do you mean one shell in, two shell out, or something like that? Or how do you think about it? Yeah, so this is the regulatory offsetting. Okay, and the other question is, it seems like we are moving from text to numbers, but the numbers are of restrictions like shall or must and so on. But one shall is not equivalent to one shall, so we end up with the similar dilemma that what we count as word are not equivalent. But still you make something out of that. Can you repeat the rationale or make sense of this limitation?
Yeah, so we certainly recognize the limitation. And that was why I was saying earlier that RegData really is useful only when you're looking at a large enough number of restrictions, large enough number of shalls, because because of the law of large numbers here, right? The average effect, if you aggregate enough, if you have 10,000 was the number I used earlier, 10,000 different shalls, you take a sample of 10,000 randomly from the Code of Federal Regulations and compare it to another 10,000 randomly, the average effect should be similar. We expect to see, right, some sort of mean, some sort of normal distribution of the average effect. That's at the heart of the approach here. But I certainly wouldn't recommend saying one additional shall, if that's what you're looking at, is going to show up using RegData as something significant. It doesn't really work that way for RegData. You get an average effect of one additional shall, but of course that shall, if in reality, it could be much less or much more in terms of its real effect on the economy than what the average effect is pulled out from different regressions. So it's good for looking at things like regulatory accumulation over a long period of time, right? Because there we have large numbers. It's maybe not so good for very nuanced applications if you want to have the sort of data that's similar to what you might get pulled out of an economic impact analysis, for example. It's not equivalent. They're very different products.
Thank you. Michael and then Neil, please. Johannes, sorry, and then Neil.
Okay, sorry. Yes, hi everybody. Johannes Bauer from Michigan State University. My raise hand function doesn't seem to work in this Zoom menu, so I apologize for having to use the chat. But I had a couple of questions. Let me start with one, and that is, I like the approach of looking at cumulative regulations. But one thing that might be lost, or maybe not, and I'm wondering how you're dealing with it, is that sometimes regulations impact is actually influenced by the fact that they contradict each other, right? It's not just the number of how many regulations are, but the functional relationship to each other. I think they might enforce each other or they might contradict each other. And I'm wondering, does your data set allow somehow to tease the relationship between different types of regulations out, or is it just you're focusing just on the number?
To a degree, I think that's a great insight. First off, I agree that the interconnectedness and interplay of regulation is important, especially as the total volume gets larger. So to a degree, we can have interaction effects in our regressions, right? Because we can have regulation in a regression and then regulation squared, just as a really simple example. So yes, and we can also have those terms interacted with different drivers if you have a formal model. So in the cumulative cost of regulations paper that I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of different ways, including interaction effects, where we interact regulation with the business investment variables in the model. So investment into R&D, new buildings, new storefronts, et cetera. So to a degree, we can capture sort of an interaction effect, but we're not explicitly doing it. It's only by putting it into these regressions that are after the fact run. I think there's something there. I mean, we do see effects there in different models of like regulation squared, for example, but how exactly that works within the text, we're not teasing that out yet. We're not using out a mapping of like regulations that cite other regulations. That does occur. Like you can pull this out of the text of regulations, but I haven't turned that into useful data yet.
Thank you. Neil, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick. It was very, very interesting. And I have two questions. The first one is that we have a lot of people here who study regulations, and one of the major developments in this field over the past 2 or 3 decades has been a broader understanding of what regulation is. And today it is no longer viewed through an economic lens, but as something that affects all spheres of life. It's not only about state and government regulation, but also about private organizations, international organizations, and so on. But also that regulation is not just about restrictions, it also plays a role in constituting rights. So the question is more broadly about how you define regulation, and not just operationally, but more broadly as a construct. How do you see that? And the second question is more about the growing interest and the applications of LLMs. And as seen in your presentation, RegData has different generations, more small associations with human coding, and then to more reliance on machine learning. And my question is a general one about best practices or recommendations for using new measures. So do you have any practical tips, any recommendations for using LLMs in regulatory text, where to begin, how to proceed, and so on? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So for the first question, how do I define regulations more broadly, given that it's not just about economic effects, and also given sort of the breadth of regulation, if you consider private regulation, for example. I guess the short answer on that is, measuring restrictions isn't necessarily value laden, in the sense that restrictions of a certain type or from a certain agency, or maybe early on in the development of a country's stock of regulations, could have a positive effect on economic outcomes because maybe they're establishing initial property rights around some sort of new technology or new economic activity. And if that were the case, if you ran some regressions looking at the effect of regulation on, say, industry productivity, you might see a positive effect, not a negative effect. Like there's no implied requirement in our data that restrictions have a negative effect on any economic outcome. It's going to depend on the data and the model that you use. And in fact, in several studies I've been part of, if you look at industry effects specifically, instead of the aggregate effect across industries, some industries are positively affected by regulatory accumulation. If you add into that things like incorporation by reference of private regulations, then it becomes a whole lot murkier. In the US, I'm sure in the EU as well, there's a lot of privately developed standards that become regulation just by referencing them. Actually, I know that's the case in the EU too. That has not been incorporated into RegData so far. Some of those, in fact, I did an analysis at the federal level of the number of privately developed standards and documents that are incorporated by reference. I came up with something like 5,200 different individual standards, and then of those, over 2,000 are behind paywalls. So it's an interesting problem to think about, where there's regulations that these are regulations, but they're behind paywalls. Those aren't incorporated into this at all either. But I think that's running a little bit afield of your initial point. Your point being regulations could be positive or negative in their effect, right? And I think that's up to the data to determine. Certainly acknowledged. LLMs. So in the project that I mentioned earlier, where I'm looking to create an index of small business exemptions and exceptions, we are using LLMs in that case. You have to be careful, of course, as you all know, very carefully prompting the LLM to avoid hallucination. And also, probably the bigger thing these days, more than hallucination, is just consistency in the output. So if you're looking at a bunch of years of regulations, 1970 through 2022, for example, and you're trying to have some sort of industry specific for 80 different industries output for all the different books of regulation in all those years, you really have to make sure that the LLM is being consistent in outputting the data for all of those. Like that's more of a trick than, like, it may not be hallucinating, but it may not be doing exactly what you want, because you need consistent data across all those years for the research goal that you're trying to achieve. So that's really the big reason right now that for federal reg data, at least, we're still not using LLMs. We explored it. We looked into using this quite a while ago, but the inconsistency as you got farther back in time just proved to made performance of the metrics of industry regulation underperform compared to the machine learning algorithms. So that's, I think, a big obstacle for now. Eventually, of course, LLMs will overcome that too.
Thank you. More questions?
Yes, sorry, it seems that my raise hand function does not work.
Okay, go on, please.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation, Patrick. It was really interesting. I'm Edgar. I'm a PhD student in PSL University, studying the effects of lobbying on EU regulation. And my question is that I wanted to know if in your database you can find amendments on regulation, and if you think if this is the case, if you think it's possible then to create a measure for less or more stringency in those amendments.
So I think you're probably speaking of a feature of European regulation that may differ from American regulation, where I'm more familiar. But I'll just make some assumptions in my answer here. In the U.S., you have a body of regulations, maybe on a specific topic from a specific regulator, and you can break down for RegData. You break down the data all the way down to so there would be like a book, and there will be a chapter within the book. Sorry, so there'd be a title, which is roughly equivalent to a book, and then within that title, there's chapters, and then within that chapter, there's another section called the part, and we break it down to that level for RegData. And you could go farther if you want to. You could break it down even to the paragraph or to the sentence level. And so once you got that initial measure of the stock of regulation on a given topic for a given, from a given regulator, then you can look at how that stock changes. So I'm going to assume that's roughly what you mean by the amendments. So yes, you could do that, and then you could indeed look at the stringency of new amendments. I don't know that you're going to get much from the RegData approach here unless those amendments have enough volume. And this goes back to my answer to David earlier. If you just count the number of shalls in a new amendment to existing regulation, maybe if that's severely different from the typical number of shalls you saw in earlier regulation, maybe that indicates some sort of effect of lobbying. Maybe, but it might be a bit of a jump, and I don't know that necessarily means that there's going to be more effect on the economy or not, unless you have a large enough volume of those amendments. You're looking across a bunch of those amendments, then I think you'd be able to tease something out there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The law of large number is also true to the number of words in the regulation,
right,
or the number of regulation themselves. If you take enough larger amounts of regulation, I guess you agree about that. Let me ask a question that comes in the text from Shmuel. Our experience of RegData Project can support improvement management data in the fields of welfare and social services and health. Thank you so much, Shmuel. So this is the text of the question. So what's the logic? Let me help or make sense of what is the logic of the project. How do you expect such a project to make improvement in human welfare beyond regulation?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not hard to actually do this. You can take RegData and associate it with the positive outcomes that regulations are designed to achieve. And so I've done a paper like this myself where I looked at safety outcomes for a specific industry and looked at how regulation, the accumulation of regulation that in that industry was associated with those outcomes. And so, depending on what you're looking at and what the results are, if you find, for example, a lack of effect of regulation or a certain type of regulation on the benefits or the positive outcomes that you're hoping that they achieve, then that could be an indicator of the need for improvement. I think that that sort of retrospective analysis is fairly rare in the U.S., where regulators themselves would look back and see if their regulations are effective. So that's the sort of application that probably could make a lot of headway very quickly, because that sort of analysis just generally isn't done, at least in the U.S. I think it's probably true in most countries.
One more question, last series of questions, because I see that I don't see any other people raising their hands, and I'd like to ask you this question. So probably most of the restrictions are around environmental, or a lot of the restrictions are environment focused, maybe safety focused, less labor focused, labor rights focused. If this is just a guess. And the question is, does it make sense, or is it possible easily to take the data that you have really and use this to do a different type of classification or more complex shell classifications? And this is actually also the second question: how accessible is the data for other scholars? So is it open access, or what are the conditions? Where do we find them? For example?
I'm glad you asked that. I should have said that earlier. Yeah, the data are available. If you go to, there's a few different websites, but if you go to regdata.org, that will redirect you to the website where the data are available. And I'd suggest going just to the bulk download page. You'll see there's the U.S. federal data is available for bulk download, U.S. state data, Canadian, et cetera. It's all there. So yeah, please have at it. Email me. David, feel free to redistribute my email address if you have questions. Some of the data sets are more user-friendly than others. And then going to the first question, yeah, right now we can break down regulation by topic area based primarily on which regulator is outputting the regulation. So you do see the trends that you described, David. In the U.S., for example, Environmental Protection Agency regulations was a relatively small part of the code in the 80s. And then in the 90s, there were a couple of major laws that made regulators at the EPA start producing a lot more. And now they're one of the major parts of the code. It's not the majority, but it is a large, probably the plurality of regulations at this point, I guess would be the term, are environmental. Maybe something like a third, maybe would be my guess right now. I haven't looked at it lately. But I do think it's also interesting to test the assumptions that everyone has about regulation, and our data do allow that. I think most people, when they think about regulations, they do assume most must be environmental, or maybe environmental plus safety. I don't know that always holds at all points in time for all jurisdictions. We have not developed specific classification algorithms to classify into those broadly defined topics, other than breaking things down by regulator itself. I mentioned that paper earlier that I did on the effect of Dodd-Frank, how many regulations came out of the Dodd-Frank Act. For that one thing I did was just aggregated the different financial regulators into one single data set. So that's sort of one way to get at it, right? In the US, there's basically 7, depending how you count, 7 major regulators that are in finance and banking. So you can aggregate the data for all those, and then suddenly, voila, you have a data set for how much finance and banking regulations there are over time. It's very similar to the industry classification approach, but sometimes there's not an environmental industry, of course, so sometimes you need to aggregate agencies instead.
Yeah. And last question before Neil concludes. So if you think about the effect of your data collection on the social science literature and so on, can you cite one study where you said, okay, this guy or those guys use the data that I build, and I'm so happy. It proves that I made a difference. This is a success story. What are you proud of?
Interesting.
Beside your work, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I built this. I guess I didn't anticipate it would be as big and long running as it has been when I initially built it. I built it because I wanted to do that study on the effect of regulation on economic growth, the one that I talked about already. But as I built it, I realized there's a lot more that can be done with the data than that. And so one family of research that I think is particularly interesting, I've been part of it, but I have not been the leader in it, is looking at the effects of regulation on metrics of regressivity, I guess I would say. Things like income inequality, poverty rates. So that was certainly not in the front of my mind when I built it. I wanted to think about economic growth, but researchers have found, in fact, there was a paper in European Journal of Political Economy recently by someone I don't know, who inferred a causal relationship between the accumulation of regulation and greater income inequality using state reg data. So I thought that was really cool. Like these sort of insights into things that weren't at the front of my mind, given my background, but that the data have allowed.
Excellent, thank you. Nir concludes, please.
Yes, okay, so thank you very much, Patrick, for your presentation. We are very happy to have you here with us. Next week, we'll have another speaker in the series. On Thursday, we will advertise the details soon. And until then, have a good day ahead and good evening, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.